Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for another Q-Tips session. My name's Elizabeth Miller and I'm CEO here at Quaint Business Solutions. I also have Travis Thurston, one of our amazing Quaint consultants, who's going to help me do this walkthrough today. So Quaint is an SAP Business One provider who values excellence in customer service as well as our knowledge of the SAP B1 application. And part of what we do here at Quaint is to ensure that we're always showcasing the great features within the B1 application, as well as helping to empower you, our customers, as well as others using the SAP B1 system to its fullest capabilities. So today we are featuring the out-of-the-box functionality surrounding forecasting and the MRP wizard. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, we will have a question and answer time at the end of our presentation. So just be sure to jot down any of your questions and we'll be happy to answer those at the end. Thanks for being here, Travis, and for assisting us today with this walkthrough. And whenever you're ready, feel free to take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Liz, and welcome everybody on the call. So we're just going to go ahead and jump right in here with the MRP and the forecast. And for today's agenda, what we're going to do is cover item master setup, forecast setup, how we could generate a forecast via sales history, and then a quick overview of the MRP wizard. So the start of everything with MRP and SAP is based on your item code setup. That is the basis of everything on how you're going to get your recommendations in SAP from the MRP. It's also how you're going to make sure that things are included within the MRP so that you do get recommendations on those. So in the item master data, on your planning tab, you have some important fields that we're going to discuss. First and foremost is your planning method. That's going to be if you plan to use this in the MRP where you define it as being part of the MRP. So there's only a couple options there. It's either none or MRP. So that tells the system, hey, we want this to be included when we're making recommendations. Your procurement method is going to be the way in which the MRP gives you a recommendation related to that item. So primarily, if you purchase the item, you would want to select buy, and if you make the item, you would want to select make. That way, the MRP is saying, oh, well, you typically would purchase this from a vendor, so we're going to recommend a purchase order in this instance, or maybe a purchase request, depending upon how you have things set up. Versus doing a production order if you have it set to the make setting. So that way they're like, oh, well, you typically make this in-house. So we're also going to recommend that you make a production order for this item. Your order interval is the amount of time in which the MRP would make recommendations related to how often you would either make or purchase something. So in that sense, you can define either a certain number of days, whether it be weekly or whether it be monthly. So then when the MRP is crunching over all of that data in relation to the item, it's going to look at this and say, well, based on demand and supply, we're saying you should order this in this amount of time because you're going to need it down the road in this interval to make up for the demands that you have related to your supply. Your order multiple is the amount in which you want it to give you recommendations for. So if you typically order it as 1 or 5 or 25 or 10, those would be the settings that you want to define there. And then on your minimum order quantity, this is essentially what you want the system to always recommend, or say you have a vendor that you purchase an item from that gives you a break if you always order at least this minimum amount of quantity from that particular vendor, then you would want to set your minimum order quantity to that, because that will be the first amount that the MRP recommends to purchase. Based on the fact that that is your minimum. So if your demands, or rather I should say, yeah, your demands versus your supply means that you would have 3 needed, but your minimum is 10, you're always going to have 10 as a recommendation. That can be adjusted at a later date, but that's how the MRP is going to take it into account. That also is true for how you make things too. So your minimum order quantity might be how often when you make something do you make a certain set quantity. Then the last two are kind of the ones that have a tendency to throw most people for a loop, is your lead time and your tolerance days. So your lead time is how long you're saying it typically takes you to make the part, or how long it takes for you to get the part from your vendor that you're ordering from. So that one's a little bit more straightforward in the fact that the system's going to say, well, you're saying it takes at least 3 to 5 to 10 to 15 days, whatever you may have defined. So when it makes a recommendation based on when it thinks it needs the availability of the item on hand, it's taking that into account to see if we place the order today or we place the production order today, would you have it within that time? So that's going to help you see if you're meeting or not meeting your needs of having goods related to your demand. But your tolerance days is more of a buffer. So if you had 1 or 2 defined in tolerance days, essentially the MRP knows that theoretically a 5-day window rather than a 3-day window is acceptable. So it's going to give you that recommendation related to that. And just to kind of give you guys an idea of what that looks like within SAP, here we have a item master that we had put together that has it set up as a buy method. We do have it being included in the MRP. We're saying that we're going to always order this on the first of the month. We're ordering at least a multiple of 1 with a minimum quantity of 10. And we expect it's going to take us at least 3 days to get it, but we'll accept up to 4 days in a recommendation before we're considering that as being overdue. So once you have your items defined, then you can create a forecast to also use in the MRP. What a forecast does for you is it allows you to also kind of estimate or artificially increase the demand of what you're expecting to get. So aside from what you already have in SAP in forms of sales orders or in forms of purchase orders for supply, forecasts are primarily based on increasing demand for an item. So if your current set of sales orders gives you, say, 100 of an item is currently needed to fulfill a particular month, but you know, hey, we have potential for more items to come in on that month, you can define a forecast to increase that to that amount so that the MRP, when making recommendations, takes that into account and is showing that you would have an increased demand against the items that you're trying to sell. The benefit of that is that the ideology behind the MRP within SAP is that it is trying to always bring your balance down to 0 so that you hit a balancing point. So based on the balance of your supply and your demand, it's making recommendations to bring it to that point. There are ways to kind of work around that, but that's in general the idea of what the MRP is trying to do. So when you're creating your forecast, which we'll hop back over to SAP real fast here. When you're creating your forecast, you're going to define your forecast code, your forecast name. These can typically be the same thing. This is a unique identifier. This is just your descriptor. But you'll also define a date range based on how you want to view the forecast that you're creating. So if it's a daily forecast, weekly, or monthly, you can set it up in that way, and then also set your range of how far you're going to take that out. So depending upon your needs, if you're doing a lengthy forecast versus maybe a more timely forecast, you would set it up that way. So then once you've defined the items that you have, so let me pull up one that we've already got prepared here. You can see that I defined a couple different items here for a couple different warehouses. You can define this per warehouse. So if you wanted to create a forecast that only impacted a singular warehouse in the MRP run, you could have everything here going to the same one. Or you can use one forecast for multiple locations within your business. I generated some numbers here to drive some demand related on particular months. one of the nice features of the forecast is that you also have the ability to increase your demand on the fly through percentage points. So if you click on the number and then you can shift click to highlight multiples, you can increase your demand on the fly through percentages based on your base numbers that you have. Or if you felt like those numbers were a bit less, or that you're expecting to have a bit less in sales of some sort, you can also decrease those numbers and it automatically generates that for you, and then you would just update your forecast. So if you want to use your sales history to generate forecast, then what you can do is click on your generate forecast button, which we'll show you in just a moment. And what this allows you to do is have item range selection, item group selection, so that it generates that out based on the items that you have. You don't have to have items even in the forecast yet. When you're doing this, this will put all of that in there for you. And you can define the warehouse you want to be selected. And then when you're looking at your sales history, you have two options typically, but of those two options, only like simple average is always going to be there, but then based on how you're viewing your forecast, whether it be daily, weekly, or monthly, you then have the daily, weekly, monthly average. So it's going to average out your sales based on those. And then you can also choose whether you want the sales history to come from sales orders, or if you actually want it to come from deliveries and AR invoices. So then that way it gives you a little bit of flexibility in what you're considering a sale in that sense. And then you'll define your history start date and end date, so that way it looks to that period of time to generate that information. So let me just come back here to this one. So let's say, well, I can type today. There we go. So if I come in to generate a forecast, I'm just going to have it pull in, let's look for, say, my MRP item 1 to my MRP item 5. So we'll do a range. And I'm going to have it generate for 2 of my warehouses. And then we'll have it based on a monthly history here of my sales orders. And then I'm going to go way back because I want to get a lot of information about what I'm doing here. So obviously, the more information you have, the better it can make a determination of what your sales within a period are. It is automatically putting it within a date. So typically, if you're going to go for a year, then let's just do a more recent year. I'm working with an older database, so you'll have to excuse the times there. So you can see here, I had a blank forecast, no items added, and then I was able to generate my forecast directly off of sales history that I had within the system for those items, and it automatically put that in. Then again, I can also come in and say, well, you know, I was basing that off of a few years ago. I know things have changed. I'm actually going to have an increase in some of that by maybe about 25%. So it makes sense for me to just increase those numbers. And then you can add your forecast and you have that done. Yep, there we go. And there's the forecast. So then that brings us to the MRP wizard. So once you have your items defined and you have your forecast created, you can then run through your MRP wizard, which is 6 steps. And I'm going to kind of cover these at a high level, but this will take the information that you provide and it will give you recommendations based on the settings that you go through. So I'll touch on some of the important points here with the MRP. So I have a predefined one here. You can either create scenarios or select existing. And when you're creating your MRP wizard run. Give it a description of what you want to come back to at a later date if you need to. Your planning horizon is the period of time with which you're going to look through and get recommendations for. You can define it within days, weeks, or months, similar to how your forecast is defined. You can have it take into consideration holidays for either production or purchase. So that way, if you have a holiday calendar defined in your company definition, you can have that included within this so that it makes better recommendations related to that. Cumulative lead time, this is one that I think also a lot of people wonder about, and that is cumulative lead time. If you're not ignoring it, it knows that if it takes 3 days on a particular item and you have that particular item over multiple times, it's going to add that 3 days to 3 days to 3 days to 3 days, depending upon the stretch of time that you need to make that recommendation happen. If that doesn't make sense and how you want to see the result sets, when you ignore the cumulative lead time, what that does is it resets every time it's going to make a recommendation. So it's not taking into account that it just said that it's going to take you 3 days to get this here. Maybe you put in multiple purchase orders, and so each purchase order is governed by its own lead time rather than it being a cumulative lead time because maybe not everything's being shipped all at once. Something to think about when running through these scenarios. Step 2, you're going to go ahead, or rather step 3, you can go ahead and add the items that you want to include. So you can add items here, or you could actually just run it for all items if you wanted to, depending upon how many you have. On step 4, you're defining how you want it to give you recommendations based on a company level or a warehouse level. Company level is kind of like everything all consolidated into a singular. So it's going to make recommendations in this instance with transfer documents sometimes if you have maybe quantities on hand at another warehouse that you could ship to another warehouse. So something to think about there. If you look at it from a warehouse perspective, it's going to look at each warehouse individually and make recommendations per each warehouse more in alignment with purchase orders or production orders specifically for that warehouse. And then step 5, this is the kind of one where you can make the most of everything that you're doing, which is how you want to look at your recommendations, whether it be within your planning horizon or if you want to also include historical data, because sometimes what that does is it gives you different recommendations because it knows that there's some previous demand rather than just the demand and supply that you have within the planning horizon that you're looking at. You can choose to, on your supply, include existing purchase orders, blanket agreements, and for demands, sales orders and production orders. So production orders can actually be a supply and demand together because it could be that you're using some of those as components versus the sale items that you're making. You can also include like existing inventory transfer requests or other recurring transactions. Inventory level just is a setting where you're going to define if you want it to give you recommendations based on your defined required minimum or min-max. And then for your forecast, you can choose a singular forecast or you can choose multiple forecasts. So if you choose to include more than one forecast, you can do that here. And then for recommendations, it's always going to make recommendations for purchase and production, but then you can choose to include purchase requests or purchase as purchase orders or purchase requests when it's making the recommendation. Then when you run the scenario, it gives you your different pegging information, as they call it, for the items, where you can look at what you have as current supply and demand and what recommendations you're getting. So in the case of August here, we know that we have an initial inventory of 169, we have a supply of 51, and we have demand for 180. So what this is saying is that we might need to have some recommendations for August, right? So these are supplies from recommendations to make up what we need to cover that 180 demand. And if you want to look at what recommendations are being provided, you can click here to see. If you like the recommendations that are here, you just tell it to save, and then you can go back through under order recommendations at a later date and convert those to the documents that you want to use.
So we're going to take some questions here, but Travis, before we do that, if you wouldn't mind going back to the MRP, I want to clarify a few things that on a couple steps. Let's go back to step 4 just for a minute.
Correct.
Can you talk through the checkboxes here of what it means to include existing or include demand, and when, maybe a few examples of when you might want to uncheck those instead of having them all checked?
Yeah, so in this instance, this is where, again, based on if you're running at company or warehouse level, you're saying, when I run the MRP, do I want to look at existing inventory within a warehouse? Maybe I do or I don't. So if you don't, you would uncheck that warehouse of including existing inventory, right? Then it's the same with including demand and supply. If you have a reason to not want to include demand from a warehouse or supply from a warehouse within the MRP, you would make those selections here, because there could be times where, say, like in this case, a drop ship, I don't want to include any of that because it's a drop ship. It's coming straight from a vendor straight to somewhere else. It's not coming into my inventory. It's not something I want to use. But from an inventory perspective, I may not want to include it, but perhaps I want to include it in my supply. So you could augment that at that point in time.
Okay, awesome. And then if you'd go forward to step 5, I had a question on this.
Yes.
Or just wanted to clarify too. Can you talk a little bit about the restriction area on the right-hand side? If I understand it correctly, when you check like to include purchase orders, there may be instances where you have a specific purchase order, let's say that you ordered for a specific customer and you ordered 50 of something, and you really don't want it to be included in this because it's a one-off thing. You have the ability, correct, to click that restriction and then choose specific documents you want to exclude. So it gives you that flexibility. It's not an all or nothing. You can actually say, and I think you might have to click on that add documents to see a list, but you can take out specific documents to really hone this in. And again, we're doing a basic overview of this MRP. You can get very detailed, and if you have specific questions, feel free to bring them up in a minute when we're going to do those questions. But I just wanted to clarify that you do have that capability to get down into a granular level of including or excluding specific documents if that applies in your specific scenario case. Okay?
Absolutely. Good point.
So I know we did have a question come through on the chat. I'm going to read that one. I think it's from Joshua. Does the start and end date, I think this was on the forecasting window, Travis. So the question was, does the start and end date just view the forecast in those months, or does it also take into account demand in those months?
So when you're creating a forecast, this is what you're adding in addition to what the system is already going to take into account. So this is a forecast itself does not look at anything existing in the system unless you're generating the forecast and you're including sales history, and then it would give you some sense of what it thinks you need to do within that period of time. But if you were, say, generating a forecast like this where I'm not using sales history, I'm just plugging in the numbers for myself, it's not thinking about what's currently there at that point. This is just what I'm saying in addition to what's already there is going to be there. So your start and end date here is just where you want to include that additional demand.
Okay, it looks like that answered Joshua's question.
Okay, good.
I did want to say something on this too. There may be some questions with regards to, can you import forecasts?
Right.
Or if a lot of people I know do forecasting and things like that in Excel. So how easy is it for them to move the data either through importing or can they copy to? Can you talk about some of that and how best to do it if you first, analyze outside the system?
Yeah, so you can. One of the major benefits of SAP, obviously, is the ability to right-click, if I can right-click here, and copy table. So when you do that, you can take that data and paste it directly into an Excel. You can do that with a blank forecast. So if I were to be in add mode here, I could right click and say copy table, and it's going to copy the way this is set up as like an Excel spreadsheet. So if I change my range, and I go and I copy table here, and I go to paste that into Excel, which I don't know that I have an Excel up right now, but like if I were to do that, it would paste in this in that format. So then I could update the data in the Excel in this format and then copy those, come back in, right click and tell it to paste. And then you get this question typically. So depending on how you copied it, if you copy it with the headers from your Excel, you would say yes, otherwise no. And it will paste that value of what you have copied from Excel directly into the forecast. So yeah, there is a way for you to kind of generate all of that within the Excel. And I highly recommend copying a blank template of this into an Excel to populate and work with, because it just allows you to import back into SAP much more efficiently.
Yeah, excellent point. I do know that making sure you have it in the same column row, column order, excuse me, is key for the copy paste to be effective. So great point. To any of our audience, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. We do normally mute everyone just for convenience of the recording, but I do believe you're able to unmute. If you're not, if you can just text me and let me know and we'll unmute you. But does anybody else have any other questions?
I think Jake has a question.
Yeah, Jake.
I do. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
So our business model is rather unique, and we don't typically sell the same products on a regular basis. I mean, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. So I guess my question is, I didn't see anything, and maybe I missed it. Are there options for forecasting with alternative items with this module?
So like, are you using, alternative items.
So if we have 15 of it's medications, so let's say there are several different types of medications that are, you have your brand and your generics.
Right.
In the event that you're selling basically the same product, you want to be able to look at alternatives and kind of combine the forecast for that alternative group. Is that possible in this module? Not by item specific, but by group.
Right. Alternative items are a little bit harder to work with. But yeah, if you had, say, maybe item group and you're forecasting by item group, what you would do in that instance is, or like if you were trying to, get recommendations for items within a group, when you go to add items, you could add items not based on a range, but based on a group. And then it would add all of those items in here, and then it could give you recommendations for those items based on how you have them defined. If you're looking for it to, say, give you a recommendation based on the fact that, well, if you sell this one name brand, but you have these 3 other alternative brands,
yep,
it's a little bit harder for it to do that out of the box. I would have to look and see if there's a really good way to tie that together, whether it be through phantoms or maybe if you have things defined as alternates within SAP. It might automatically take that into account, but that's something I'll have to come back to you with just to confirm or deny.
No, that answers my question. I had just one other question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
With this module, has anybody utilized it in a way that if they had the Boyum usability package where they did some kind of forecasting module for for a dashboard or something?
Mm-hmm.
That was more automated, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, I will say the out of the box MRP is a little lacking sometimes. It can be really good, but sometimes when you come across really specific scenarios, or if you're trying to use things with Boyum, there's mild interactions with that. So I can't think of anything off the top of my head where somebody has used it in that capacity.
Okay.
Liz, do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, not that I know of, Jake. I don't have anybody that I can think of that's using that in a more automated way. Is there a specific scenario that you were thinking of or hoping for, Jake?
Well, the dream in a purchaser's world is to always forecast on a kind of a ongoing real time basis, but also kind of seeing the future. That's the ultimate game, right? That the ultimate game plan is to see the future. And I think with the dashboards that have the automation of somewhat automatically updating, if you're able to capture those, and there's a lot of options here to be able to see interactions happening real time from SAP. If there was a way to kind of show continually run this based upon a specific criteria that could be modified real time while you're looking at the dashboards, I could see a ton of futures. The reason I say that is I've looked at in depth at the coding on the Boyum, one of the dashboards for their WMS, and the real time functionality there to be able as a sourcing agent has tremendous capabilities. I actually did that for them, modified a little bit of the dashboard to make it so it's real time, and they actually using that somewhat as a forecasting tool. But this has quite a bit more capabilities to limit and make changes on the fly. So I was just wondering if there was some kind of a hybrid out there for this, or if anybody had done anything. But it sounds like it'd probably be overly complicating things, maybe.
Yeah, the only thing I could say that would help you maybe run it faster, not necessarily with Boyum, but to what Travis had said, you can save these scenarios, so you don't have to do this step by step every time. And you can skip steps with that saved scenario. So if you had that saved scenario, you can go right to run instead of going step by step and get the recommendations really quickly. Of course, I'm sure you could program something if you like to get you there, or to put it, as a widget or somewhere as a quick thing, but to actually see the recommendation in a dashboard, I haven't seen anybody do that, because it would almost be, I would think, either it's going to take you right here and run it because all the history is here, or you're going to be almost rebuilding the logic of what the MRP is doing in some kind of query in the background to have it be on a dashboard. Can it be done? Yes.
Yeah.
Right. But you'd be reinventing the wheel. I'm not sure that it would be worth the time. When again, you can just do the save scenario, click run, and have it in a couple seconds. Yeah. So that's the only thing I can think of, that might help in that scenario, but it's not necessarily the dashboard that I think you're looking for.
Makes sense. And I'm not trying to recreate the wheel. I just was curious if that wheel had already been created.
No, I appreciate the question. It's a great question.
Maybe that's something we should take back to Boyum and say, hey, Boyum.
Yeah, show us it in real time.
To evaluate their WMS dashboards, that functionality, and build the MRP dashboard with some similar logic, but more geared towards what is in the out-of-the-box scenario. For this MRP would be, I think that would be a game changer for some in the sourcing world.
I've had similar people ask similar questions before. I think it's something that a lot of people are actually looking for, Jake.
Yep.
So that might be some process improvement down the road.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Jake, this is Josh. When you're talking about that dashboard that you're looking at, are you looking for something like where it says, on your dashboard, it says product A has experienced a spike above its average inventory over the last 12 months. So product A, normally you sell 12 a month. So far this month, you've sold 24. You might want to look at that. Is that like kind of what you're talking about?
Similar. So what I've done is, in some of the dashboards I kind of created something that's like the MRP. It's looking into the future for some products based upon some historical with some specific criterias. But yeah, it's and I guess the nuts and bolts is just looking for real time to, hey, look at this item. You might potentially need to touch it because there's some there's also a flag that we've created that says here are alternative items. you need to evaluate all of them as potential opportunities. What product is, if you can get any of these are all linked together. This item here is moving faster than others, but it might be you can't get any of these products, but maybe you should consider looking at these as a whole, not just as an individual. I mean, just like you showed on this scenario where you're looking at a company versus an individual warehouse site on one of those tabs.
Yeah.
It's similar to that is what I was thinking. And then having it real where sourcing agents, especially in our business, they're constantly hunting for product and looking for product on it. So they need that real time capability of, well, what's hitting behind the scenes, so I don't have to worry about running reports and trying to figure out what I need. I'm getting requests directly from our users, but also to have that data gathered in a dashboard that can show them real time, because we've created some scenarios with the purchase request process that allows us to gather that data real time. So that's kind of what I've been leveraging, is some different functionality there. Sorry,
That's
that was very
interesting.
long and went down a whole other way, so I apologize.
No, that's good. I've never thought to use that to think that MRP could be utilized as a tool that way. My problem with forecasting has always been, I went to a seminar where they taught about it, and it was basically you can only forecast about 30% of your items, because you can't necessarily forecast items when you don't have consistent usage. So items that have sporadic usage can't be forecasted because MRP is a big machine, but it can't predict the future. So then it got to the point where I was saying, well, how do I know what items are consistent usage? So then I had to start building like scenarios or UDFs. I'm known as the UDF king over here. I build UDFs to helpfully give me that data, so then I can eventually do a forecast. I've actually yet to actually do a forecast in MRP successfully, because I constantly adjust min maxes as though that is my forecast. So I share your pain in that regards.
I've been doing the same with the min max as well, to build MRP, but the logic within the WMS, the Boyum WMS, there's potential there to build kind of that crystal ball based upon the feedback, the internal interactions happening within SAP from your sales team, we're using purchase requests. Even if we're unable to fulfill it, we're able to capture the data and the requests and information that you can kind of start building over time, seasonal things, and just really being able to have that crystal ball of next year around this time. Hey, the last 2 years about this time, everybody was asking for it. Not only do you not have inventory, but you should be looking at this amount or potentially this quantity.
Okay.
Data you have.
Yeah.
Travis,
good feedback,
though,
Jake.
That some of that after you've built up a history in the system, of course, of a few years, be able to be used that forecasting of the actual sales.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that. So, like, you could generate multiple forecasts. You could have a yearly forecast, right? Like, so say I want to, like when we were generating a forecast earlier, correct? Based off, say, simpler monthly history. We'll say a simple average in this case. It automatically goes to a year period, right? No matter what you do, based on the year that you have. But when you pull that information in, you could theoretically save this, if I'm not mistaken. Let's say we want to save this as a sales history here. Yeah, so you can only go 7 years within a view. So I would have to change this, obviously. But let's do this so I quit getting an error here. If I were to change this down to this year. What I was going to say is I think what you could do is essentially generate a forecast of time for different years and then include multiple forecasts within the scenario. So if you wanted to kind of have like multiple histories, right, of sales and forecasts and things, you could do that. But the general idea of the forecast, at least in SAP's estimation of how to use a forecast related to the MRP, is you're generating additional demand comparative to what you already have in SAP as sales orders and other things. That's also kind of
with like let's say around Christmas, you sell more of something. If you wanted to see what the demand was for the last 2 years,
but that's where this comes in. The include historical data in your time range. So if you include historical data here, when you run the MRP, you get this other column instead of just past due. You get historical data, and this will take into account stuff within the year or things previous to your planning horizon that then also generates supply and demand, especially like if, say, you have a sales order that's been open for a while or sales quotation of some sort that you're going to copy to a sales order that's been open for a while. Maybe it's pre your planning horizon. You can include that information within the MRP.
Makes sense.
Does that kind of answer your question too, Liz?
I think so. Can you go back one step? So that historical data, though, that's not necessarily, I mean, that's predicting stuff like you're saying before the horizon. But if you're trying to predict based on like 2 years history of a certain time period around these months, let's say, that I think that forecasting thing that you were saying of build the history off of the sales history and then include those two would help show what was happening previously in a specific time period for your months ahead within this planning horizon, which I think was one of the scenarios that Jake had brought up. So I was just thinking that I think with that forecasting, if you played with it to show it off of the history before, might help you in that case to use it in that capacity.
Agreed. And that it does have the capabilities it looks like on that purchase requests, which is if you were just to focus in on purchase requests and sales or deliveries, does this have deliveries? I see sales orders, but just production orders.
Yeah, not deliveries. Your deliveries and AR invoices or deliveries and invoices is more in your forecasting if you're going to generate from there. But for sources of supply and demand, it's purchase orders, purchase quotations, sales orders, sales quotations.
And that's what currently is happening, right?
Correct.
This is to say, what do you currently have on purchase order and sales order should be included to help predict what you should order for the demand of the future or what you did in the past. You would use the forecasting for that, right?
So if I came in and generated a forecast, let's say based off of this, right?
Or right there is the radio button, right, for the deliveries and AR invoices if you wanted to go off of that specific history, Jake. This is where you would choose that for a time period and it would pull that in. So that would be your real sales, right? Not just orders, but your real sales for a specific time period. Right. And then you can save this forecast and you can create multiple. So like Travis was saying, you could create this for 2022, 2023. And then pull both of those forecasts into your MRP on this step 5. You choose the forecast, multiple forecasts, and choose those 2 years of forecasts to help you predict what you should be ordering because of that in the past and then what you currently have on order and sales orders now. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it would take a little bit of work, but it's doable.
Yeah.
And then Josh, to your point of things that are in the past, you had it here or there, but was sporadic. I think this could also still be useful in your case to go off of what the history was previously to say, did I have demand here or there? And it would pick up those sporadic sales to kind of help you decide if you need it or not. So it's something to consider in your case as well, Josh, if that would help you.
Would that be the benefit of doing two separate forecasts. So I do a forecast for like 22 to 23 and 23 to 24 versus 22 to 24. So the difference would be if I do two forecasts, I can see the change in demand rather than an average demand over a 2-year time frame. Is that the reason why you would do two forecasts over one?
We were saying two because when you go to the generate forecast, if you're doing it off of actual sales, it only lets you do 1 year at a time.
Gotcha.
Right.
And so then if you wanted to show both, it unfortunately won't let you change the end date. So if you put in the begin date, it just defaults, if you just want to show that again real quick, it always defaults to just 1 year. So if you really need to go 2 years, we were saying save each year individually and then grab both.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it's a limiting factor in the forecasting, but you can get around it because you're allowed to pull in multiple and you can have limitless numbers of forecasts. So
right. Also, I mean, I know everybody's favorite tool is the DTW, obviously, and I'm being sarcastic there, but you can import multiple forecasts and you could take real data that you have and create forecasts via the DTW for historical data if you already kind of have that together. And then you would already have these pre-built instead of having to go in and do it through the UI. So that's just a side option there if you ever wanted to do it that way. But
right. Or like we said, if you have it in Excel, as long as you made it in this same kind of a format
correct.
Here, column-wise, you can copy paste into it. So you can do all of your stuff outside and bring it into the system, or you can do it in the UI. And then like what he was showing, if you go off the historical and you say, yeah, but I want to increase this by 25% or something like that, you can highlight the rows. They do have to be highlighted before you click the increase, and you can increase certain rows or multiple rows to change that as well. Or you can one-off go to a specific cell date and time and change it as you will. So there's flexibility in that at any time to change it. But in both of your scenarios, I feel like it might behoove you both to try that generate forecast of the previous data and see if how that's impacting it as you play with the MRP a little more. As I think in both cases, you may have some interesting results from that would help you with using the MRP.
Agreed.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the questions. These are great questions that I think a lot of people are benefiting from. So thank you for bringing them up. Do we have any other questions or scenarios that anybody wants to walk through?
I did have a question about cumulative lead time. Your explanation made sense, but I didn't understand I didn't understand after I ran the scenario with or without cumulative lead time, how that would affect the MRP order recommendations.
Right. So
because I have a scenario where occasionally I'll get a request for an item to be ordered on two separate lines. And I thought it was related to a lead time situation, but I'm not entirely sure why it's doing that. Why is it telling me to order the same thing twice rather than ordering one line with that product, twice as much of that product? I'm thinking maybe that's because I have ignore cumulative lead time unchecked, but I'm not entirely sure.
Well, I mean, if you have it unchecked, it should be thinking about cumulative lead time together. So maybe what it's doing is giving you two recommendations because it's saying to order one here and one there to cover that need, rather than it looking at it each time and saying, oh, well, it's going to take 3 days to get this, so I'm just going to order this one kind of thing, or however long your lead time is.
If I check that box, it will consolidate the lines to bring all of it in at once rather than a purchase order for this tomorrow and a second purchase order a week later. Is that the...
Right. Yeah, because it's saying that, hey, you could just order all of this at the same time. It doesn't matter, when it's not thinking about how the lead times might be affecting an order coming in. Where when it's looking at how it might affect it coming in, it might be like, well, hey, if you place one now for this quantity, it'll meet this demand here, but then you're going to want to place another one for this quantity later because it's going to take you this much time to get that.
correct. Okay, that's my problem and solution. Thank you. That's exactly what's happening.
Yep. Yeah, because it's always, like I said, it's always trying to take it to that 0 point. The way that you kind of get around that is by using minimums on your item code. So not setting min max, but just setting minimums. So if you set a minimum and you're saying, I want to always maintain, but not necessarily enforce, right? Like it's not required. If you set a minimum, what the MRP looks at is, oh, you have to keep at least this much inventory on hand. So then it's going to try to take your balance point to that point, right? So then it'll give you a different set of recommendations because it'll say, well, you have to have at least 100 on hand. So if this takes you below 100, I'm going to do this additional order to bring you back up to 100.
Got it.
Or
is that
the equivalent based on your order interval.
Now, actually,
or order multiple.
Do I have time for one more question?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely.
Sorry. You just brought me into another question. Can you go to the end of the MRP wizard?
Yeah, right here. You want to look at step 5?
Yeah. Step 5.
Okay.
And I think you were just talking about that. So can you break it down into a little bit more specific terms? When you check that inventory level box, there's required, minimum, maximum, and then minimum, maximum. Like, I believe I understand that's what it means is basically anytime I run an MRP scenario, it's trying to take me to the minimum for minimum. And then for maximum, anytime I run.
Defined for that. So let's say under my inventory data here, I'm defining a minimum on this item as, 100, right?
Yeah.
It's going to say, okay, well, I want to keep at least 100 on hand. So I can go past that. I can have less because of supply and demand. But if I go under that 100, then I need to make sure that I order whatever my multiple is to get to 100 or a little more, right? So if I do an order multiple and it takes me to 110, it's still going to order that 1 and suggest that 1 because it gets me over the 100 mark. But if it didn't, it would do however many other recommendations it would need to get you above that minimum, at least, or try to meet that minimum, because then we're including that in the MRP run of how we're looking at it.
Yep. So basically, inventory level minimum means whatever your minimum is for that item, MRP is going to recommend you to order at least the minimum.
Yeah, to get to that point. So based on after you take out all your demand from all your supply, if you're under that, it's going to make another recommendation to take you up to that.
Got it. So that's how I understood minimum, maximum, and required. I don't know what minimum dash maximum means.
So what that means is it's going to look at what your min and your max is and make a recommendation to get you to fall in between there. However, I will say that has a tendency to be a little buggy. So it's always better to work off of minimums rather than trying to go in between the range.
Gotcha. Thank you. That makes perfect sense.
Absolutely. And one thing to keep in mind with required inventory level is that if you do set that has impacts on when you can actually release inventory and deliveries or production orders or things of that nature, because it's saying it's a required amount. So if you go below that, depending upon how SAP is set up, that could prevent you from doing certain types of transactions. So I typically say, unless you really need to enforce that, minimum inventory is the better one, because you can dip below a minimum without it preventing you from doing a transaction.
Would it be safe to say, Travis, that a min is more like a recommendation rather than required is more like a mandatory?
Correct. And you can still make minimum block transactions in your document settings and stuff, but you're less likely to have that be the default. Where required, it's more the default.
Right. Okay.
And is required based off of whatever you put in the required inventory level that's to the right of max inventory?
Yeah.
Got it.
You could have a min max, but you could say I have to have 50. then
Gotcha.
even if your minimum's 100, if you did something that would take you less than 50, it would stop it.
And in SAP logic, is required inventory level what we would define as safety stock, or would that technically be the min?
Yeah, that would be kind of your safety stock.
Got it.
That would be the ultimately, you can't have less than this on hand anyways, and if you tried to do that, we're not going to let you.
Sure.
So Travis, real quick, because we were talking about min max on this item master that you have up.
Correct.
There is the option, right, to manage min max at the item as a whole, as the whole company level. Or if you have that checkbox that you have right there, manage inventory by warehouse, then you can set min maxes at the warehouse level.
Correct.
If you have them at the warehouse level and in the MRP, you choose to run the planning by company, does it sum up all your mins across all the warehouses?
I believe it does.
Demand should be? Okay, I just
because it is consolidating everything across all of the company, so it's looking at it as a whole. So it's taking whatever's within the warehouse of each warehouse and how it's set, and then saying, okay, as a company, this is what you're going to meet.
Okay. So that can affect it too. The varying differences between at the item, how you're doing it, and then how you're running at the MRP versus company versus warehouse. Okay. Just wanted to clarify that. It came up as you were looking at it.
Yeah, no worries.
Any other questions from anyone else? All right, well, if that's all for today, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us directly. We'd be happy to answer any more that may come up. As if you're playing with the MRP or forecast, feel free to reach out to us. We appreciate you being here. Be sure to follow Quaint on LinkedIn. And if you're a current customer of ours, check any email announcements for our next product features and our next Q-tip sessions. Also, make sure that you pop on over to our website. And on our resource page, we have some great takeaway documents. As Travis is showing here, we have some for the MRP and forecast today. So you'll be able to get some of those and other goodies we have from prior webinars. So feel free to go over there. And thank you again for joining us, Travis. Thank you for your time. You were fantastic. And everybody have a great rest of your day.